Keeping it all in the family used to be a good thing. After all, back in the day when everyone was trying to kill each other, who could you trust but your own flesh and blood? From the pharaohs of Egypt to the European kings and queens, here are some shocking stories of incest throughout history and what ultimately led to the downfall of entire dynasties, the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were the greatest European family that ever lived. For 900 years, they ruled over huge areas of Central Europe and beyond. They were kings and queens, warriors, and Holy Roman emperors who ruled an empire where the sun never set. Their secret? They were very close. Some would argue too close. First cousins often got married, double first cousins, uncles married their nieces, and about 80% of the marriages were between close blood relatives. They were once the most powerful family in Europe, all thanks to keeping it in the family. But the same thing that allowed them to spread across Europe and dominate nations was ultimately their downfall. The Habsburg bloodline became so polluted they could no longer produce children. The Habsburg dynasty can be traced all the way back to the 10th century in Switzerland. The family took up residence in a place called Castle Habsburg, which is where the family got their name. In the 10th century, Switzerland was part of the Holy Roman Empire, not the Roman Empire, which went extinct 500 years earlier. This was the Holy Roman Empire, ruled in part by the Vatican, and whoever was at its head held immense power. 300 years later, Count Rudolf of Habsburg became the King of Germany. He used his power to quickly capture Austria and the region that is currently Slovenia. Within a century, his successors dominated the entire Holy Roman Empire. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, members of the Habsburg family were emperors of Europe. They continued to expand, pushing their borders further and further. In 1496, the Habsburg family took Spain through the strategic marriage of Philip the Handsome and the Spanish princess Juana of Castile. This brought Taiwan, Guam, the Philippines, and countless other outposts under the control of the Habsburg family. They were the first European family to control an empire where the sun never set. Because of the vast amount of land in the Americas and around the world, there was always at least one part of their vast kingdom in which daylight shone. In 1519, Charles V became the first monarch of the world. His dominion extended over 4 continents. One of the strategies for keeping the empire stable was positioning Habsburg children in all positions of power. Men in the family were encouraged to breed as much as possible. Children that weren't in line to be royalty were put into the church and given coveted positions. This allowed the family to have their tentacles in all the most important parts of, well, everything. And then it all came crashing down. It started with the Habsburg jaw. Generation after generation, Habsburg monarchs had sharply jutting jaws, lopsided mouths that would fall open, and long noses. They weren't very easy on the eyes. Then the ability for the Habsburgs to keep having children ended abruptly after hundreds of years of prosperity. Infant and child mortality within the Spanish Habsburgs rose to 50%. By the 1500s, the level of inbreeding was too great. Charles II of Spain had a single testicle that was as black as coal. His lungs were corroded and his heart was too small. His autopsy in 1700 showed all of these things, plus huge stones in his single kidney, and excess liquid in his head. Charles suffered from conditions that no one can even pronounce. It was all the result of inbreeding. Extinction was on its way for the Habsburg bloodline. In the 1740s, there was not a single male heir left in the Habsburgs. The descendants of the original family from 700 years ago were deformed and plagued by terrible maladies. They were royalty, but they suffered from epilepsy, hormone deficiencies, brain issues, you name it. The only legit Habsburg left was Maria Teresa. She did manage to carry the Habsburg name into the 20th century, but that ended with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the onset of World War I. And now for a quick break because it's shoutout time! I want to give a big thank you to Elijah Finland in the Philippines and James Norris for your amazing comments, but no one can rival the great Morgan Freeman. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button and join us because why not? The Darwin family. Charles Darwin is the man credited with discovering the secret of evolution. Yet for all his brilliance in the world of biology, he willfully contributed to the destruction of his family tree through some serious inbreeding. Charles Darwin's wife, Emma Wedgwood, was his first cousin, not his third cousin twice removed. She was his first cousin by blood. His maternal grandparents were also cousins. Charles married Emma at a time when his bloodline was starting to look a lot like that of the Habsburgs in the 1700s. Although Darwin had 10 children, 3 of them never made it to the age of 10. They sadly perished from bacterial diseases, which are highly associated with inbreeding. Infertility is another major problem with inbreeding, as you just learned with the Habsburgs. 3 of Darwin's surviving 7 children, despite having long marriages, were unable to produce children of their own. The irony here is that Charles Darwin meticulously studied hereditary evolutionary adaptation and the effects of inbreeding. He was acutely aware that everywhere in the animal kingdom, pairing animals and plants with their direct relatives results in weaker descendants. Despite his knowledge of this, he married his cousin. I should also mention that Charles Darwin didn't live that long ago. He was born in 1809, at a time when it was already illegal in most parts of the world to marry cousins. Princess Victoria Melita. Princess Victoria Melita had 2 of the most prestigious grandparents a person could ask for. Her grandmother was Queen Victoria of England, and her grandfather was Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Her mother was Grand Duchess Maria Vladimirovna, her father, Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. Victoria could have married anybody she wanted, but she fell in love with her cousin. Victoria was born on November 25, 1876. Her father was serving in the English Royal Navy. She spent a lot of time at naval bases throughout England. When she was a young woman, she went with her mother and siblings to visit Russia. That was where she fell in love with Cyril Vladimirovich Romanov, her cousin. She very much wanted to marry Cyril. But here's where your jaw is going to hit the floor. Queen Victoria, young Victoria's grandmother, didn't want a marriage to happen because Cyril was seen as too foreign. The Romanovs were not a good match, Queen Victoria said. Instead, she chose a different husband for the young Victoria. She would marry Grand Duke Ernest of Hesse, who was also her cousin. No matter which way she turned, she was faced with cousin lovin'. Things get even more scandalous. Victoria Melita married Ernest of Hesse on April 19, 1894. They didn't have much of a choice, but it was even worse for Ernest because he was of a different persuasion. He was attracted to men, not women. Victoria had to abandon the cousin she loved and who loved her back for the cousin who was not physically interested in her. But duty is duty, and Victoria soon became pregnant. Ernest was not the best of fathers or the most attentive of husbands. Victoria fell into a terrible depression. She continuously begged her grandmother for permission to divorce, but every time she was denied. Then, in January 1901, when Queen Victoria passed away, young Victoria finally got the divorce she wanted. Tragedy struck when Victoria's daughter died of typhoid. In her grief, her cousin Cyril consoled her. This led to them being married very quietly in 1905. Victoria went from one cousin to the other, and although her life had been tragic, the rest of it was fairly happy. Cyril was stripped of his titles and banished, but he and Victoria lived happily in exile in Paris. Princess Victoria died in 1936 from a stroke at a very old age. Cyril lasted another 3 years before he too passed on. The Blue Fugates. There was once a family in Kentucky so inbred their skin turned blue. They are known as the Blue Fugates. While it may sound like an urban legend, it's 100% true. The tale begins in the year 1820. Martin Fugate, who was born in France, arrived in Kentucky. This was very early in U.S. history, at a time when land was given away to anyone who would agree to build a homestead. Martin was a poor immigrant who was given a free plot of land to take care of. For him, it was a blessing. Soon enough, Martin met Elizabeth Smith. They were married and together had 7 children. Unbeknownst to them, both Martin and Elizabeth carried a very rare gene that caused them to give birth to blue children. This is according to several first-hand accounts. 4 of their 7 children had blue skin and looked like they belonged in an Avatar movie. Then things got worse. They lived in the isolated hills of eastern Kentucky, far from ample dating pools. The Fugate children didn't have much choice but to marry one another or other members of their family. There just wasn't anyone else for them to have relationships with. But because of those blue genes, the Fugates kept having blue kids. Sons married their aunts and had babies, passing along the blue skin. It's actually a medical condition called methemoglobinemia. It basically makes the blood much darker, causing the skin to appear blue. The condition isn't particularly dangerous, but having blue skin in the 19th century didn't do you any favors either. The Fugate family became more isolated as their neighbors shied away from them because of their blue skin. It was an obvious indicator of incest and backward inbreeding, which naturally caused the family much shame. Being blue was not great for the family, but they lasted surprisingly long. It's believed the last naturally born blue Fugate was Benjamin Stacy. He was the last known descendant of Martin Fugate, alive and well in Kentucky as of 1999. Have you ever seen anyone with blue skin? Let us know in the comments. Gorgo and Leonidas. If you've ever seen the movie 300, you may be familiar with the name Leonidas, but you might not remember the name of Leonidas's wife. Her name was Gorgo, and she was a very real historical figure. She and Leonidas were real-life Spartans who fought bravely against the Persians. They were husband and wife, and also related by blood. Gorgo was the queen of Sparta and one of the most important women of ancient Greece. She was so important that legendary historian Herodotus mentioned her by name. Herodotus is famous for having left women out of his accounts of ancient history. He clearly didn't like them because he never bothered to tell of their exploits, but he made an exception for Gorgo, whom he praised as an exceptional woman. Gorgo was born around the year 518 BC. She was the only child of King Cleomenes I. Legend has it that she was so brilliant, her father would allow her to be in the room during his most important meetings. She grew up as if she were already being taught to rule over Sparta. During this time, there was one man who took a significant interest in her. It was her uncle, Leonidas. She and Leonidas married and ruled Sparta together when Cleomenes I died. It's unclear what kind of problems they may have had due to their incestuous union. They had a single child together, their son Pleistarchus. Maybe they couldn't have more because their blood was tainted, but that's unclear. Legend has it that King Leonidas was a descendant of Hercules, making him part god. After his death at the hands of the Persians, nobody knows what happened to Queen Gorgo. Her name faded into obscurity. Incestuous ruling elite. 5,000 years ago, an Irish ruler was born from an incestuous union. It's more proof that such a thing was common from the earliest Egyptian pharaohs to the last Inca god kings. The discovery began in the 1960s. A man's ancient remains were removed from the famous Newgrange tomb. It's a megalithic passage tomb that dates to roughly the same time as Stonehenge. It's so incredible it's known as the Stonehenge of Ireland. Although the man's remains were excavated, the technology wasn't there yet to do any comprehensive studies on him. It wasn't until now that Lara Cassidy from Trinity College Dublin could take a peek at his DNA. When she sequenced the genome, the result was shocking. It was very clear by looking at his DNA strands that he was the product of extremely close inbreeding. I'm not talking about cousins, I mean siblings. His parents were almost definitely either brother and sister or parent-child. In the archaeological business, that's what we call first-degree relatives. The agreed hypothesis right now is that the person buried in Newgrange was a mighty ruler. The results of his DNA test show that even in prehistoric times, ruling families practiced strict incest. It's the same thing that's been found in the ruling families of the god kings who ruled the Inca Empire 500 years ago. And it's the same thing that the pharaohs did. For example, King Tutankhamun and Queen Cleopatra, both of whom were seriously corrupted by years of sibling marriages. Lot of the Bible. If you want to hear some horrendous tales of ancient incest, look no further than the Bible. There are some very dark stories, particularly the disturbing, skin-crawling story of Lot and his daughters. In the book of Genesis, a pair of angels suddenly appeared in the city of Sodom. The angels were disguised as men. They had been sent by God to see if there were at least a handful of righteous people in the city of sin. It turned out there weren't. The angels were invited into the house of a man named Lot, who was devout to God. But when the wicked men of Sodom learned there were two strange men around, they knocked on Lot's door. They didn't want to rob the strange men, nor did they want to take them out for a friendly drink in town. They wanted to do inappropriate things to them. I think you catch my drift. Lot, being a godly man, begged the men of the city to leave the strangers alone. To try and satisfy them, Lot offered his virgin daughters to the city's men. Lot was supposedly a righteous man, yet he was willing to throw his own daughters to a mob of savage, drooling men. Why? Anyway, let's fast forward to God destroying the city of Sodom. He really didn't like what happened with the angels and the mob outside Lot's house, so God destroyed Sodom in a fiery blaze of brimstone and chaos. chaos. During the destruction, Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt, but Lot made it out with his 2 virgin daughters. They hid out in a cave on the side of a mountain, and it was a fairly grim situation. Here's where the story gets even more disturbing. Lot's daughters were saddened by the loss of their mother. They were more saddened that their father wouldn't be able to have any sons. Plus, they wanted children of their own. Being stuck in a cave really sucked for everybody. The daughters hatched a plan to get their father drunk. Then they seduced him, ultimately having his children. The Bible does go on to say that Lot's children/grandchildren grew up to found 2 tribes that caused much pain and suffering. What are your thoughts on this highly taboo subject? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and come back soon for more videos. Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
King Charles II of Spain. King Charles II of Spain was so horribly ugly that he terrified his own wife. He was the very last Habsburg to rule Spain, the last in a very long line of strictly pure blood relatives. He was born on November 16, 1661, and became king when he was only 4 years old. His mother ruled as regent until he became a teenager, at a time when the Habsburgs were trying to control the entire continent of Europe. The Habsburg family originated from Austria, and through breeding with one another incestuously, managed to spread their kin into all the most major European countries. They ruled in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Spain. But because they had been intermingling together for so long, they were stricken by all kinds of maladies. Charles II, perhaps the most inbred of them all, was so deformed and intellectually stunted that he couldn't rule properly. He couldn't figure out what was going on. Nobody wanted to look at him, and it was all the result of 16 generations of inbreeding. In fact, Charles II's grandmother and aunt were the same person. He was most likely sterile and impotent and never managed to produce an heir. The deformed king had a prominent jaw, a feature known as the Habsburg jaw, as well as 2 rows of unaligned teeth. He couldn't chew his own food and could barely speak due to his gigantic tongue. It was ironic because the whole purpose of inbreeding was to keep the family strong and pure, but instead, it only wound up making the men sterile, effectively bringing about their own end. Elite Irish farmers. Just over 15 miles from Dublin, there is a circular structure from the Stone Age that rises out of the green hills over 30 feet high. The structure is made of over 200,000 tons of earth and stone and was erected by the very first farmers to arrive in Ireland. It's called Newgrange, and it was built almost 1,000 years before Stonehenge in England. It was one of the very first major monuments to be made by human hands, likely used as a ceremonial site and a communal tomb. It was the very first great construction project of an early egalitarian society. Within the Newgrange tomb, researchers looked at the DNA of a man buried in the year 3200 BC. He was found at the very center of the mound, suggesting he had been some kind of local royalty. To learn more about him, scientists studied his genes. They discovered that his parents had been so closely related that they were almost definitely brother and sister, or maybe even parent and child. According to archaeologist Jessica Smith from University College Dublin, this could be evidence of a genetically taboo social hierarchy. It's clear that an incestuous royal bloodline began in Ireland over 5,000 years ago. Long before the Habsburgs of Europe and the pharaohs of Egypt, elite Irish farmers were specifically breeding with their relatives to consolidate power and keep the wealth in the family. The mermaid condition. The legend of the mermaid originated in ancient Assyria just shy of 3,000 years ago. The Assyrians worshipped the goddess Atargatis, who was a mermaid. Her worship later spread to Greece and Rome, and the legend of the mermaid became more romantic and fanciful. In Assyrian mythology, Atargatis was a goddess of fertility who would transform into a human-fish hybrid. There was another goddess in Assyrian mythology as well called Ascalon, who had the body of a fish. Historians believe the worship of both deities merged into one, and then the story changed and evolved from there. In regards to mutations, there is one theory that claims the origins of mermaids actually has something to do with a syndrome called cyrinomylia. It's a rare and usually fatal congenital malformation caused by the fusion of the lower limbs. A person is born with their legs fused together like a mermaid tail, and while nobody's really sure what causes the mutation, it probably has something to do with corrupted genetics. Some researchers believe that the product of an incestuous relationship could have a higher chance of being born with Sirenomelia. In other words, it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that somewhere in the history of Assyria, a royal baby was born with their legs fused together. Then, the baby spawned legends of mermaids around the world. Queen Hatshepsut. In 2007, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt, Zahi Hawass, announced the discovery of Queen Hatshepsut's mummy. The body was discovered in the Valley of the Kings and was the first royal mummy identification since Tutankhamun back in 1922. The ID was made by scanning a tooth in a box with Hatshepsut's name on it, then matching that tooth to a socket in the mummy's jaw. The identification was a miracle of science and a major win for archaeology. But when they looked closer at the mummy, they discovered something important. Queen Hatshepsut didn't quite have the appearance that one might expect from the most powerful woman in Egypt during the 15th century BC. She died around 50 years old with a lot of health issues. She was grossly overweight, almost definitely stricken by diabetes, arthritis, bad teeth, and may have even died from bone cancer. The queen's poor health probably had to do with the fact that she may have been born through a brother-sister relationship, which was extremely common in ancient Egypt. Her father was Thutmose I, who married a woman named Ahmose. Based on historical evidence, Ahmose was either the sister of the recently dead pharaoh Amenhotep I or Thutmose I's own sister. Historical documents don't exactly show whose sister she was, only that she was given the official title of King's Sister. Considering all of Hatshepsut's health issues, it seems very likely she was inbred. As for tradition, she would go on to marry her own brother, Thutmose II. Princess Nahi-Ena-Ena. When the first foreigners arrived in Hawaii, one of the things they noticed the most was the practice of incest in the royal family. It was such an openly practiced tradition that there was no way they couldn't notice, and they wrote about it in their logbooks. While in many other countries it was considered a sin, here in Hawaii the practice was also strictly forbidden for ordinary people, but accepted and even encouraged for the royals. When Captain James Cook made contact with the Hawaiian people in 1778, he learned of the incestuous customs of the high society. You would think Europe would have been used to this by now. In the case of Hawaii, it wasn't merely that royalty would often breed with their own blood, but that the nearest possible relative was usually chosen for a high chief. In other words, if the chief didn't have a sister he could marry, the next closest relative would be chosen. However, it was always the child of a close brother and sister that received the most respect from the people. These children were considered of the highest caliber and closest to the gods. One of the most famous relationships was Nahi-Ena-Ena and her brother. She was a princess during the founding of the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1800s. She was born in 1815 on the South Kona Island of Hawaii. Her mother was the queen consort, and she had two older brothers. She wound up falling in love with her brother Kamehameha III, and the local Hawaiian chiefs wanted them to marry. However, by this time, Protestant missionaries had taken a firm hold on the island and on the people. The church and many of the people opposed the union, calling it a sin. The European missionaries had such influence that they were able to block the marriage and have her instead marry William Pitt Lelehoku I in November of 1835. It was her brother's! King Kamehameha III claimed it was his son and would be the heir to the throne. Even though the missionaries had prevented their marriage, they apparently couldn't prevent the romantic love of the brother and sister. She was shunned and lived in isolation until the child was born, but it died just a few hours after birth. King Vajiralongkorn. In 1972, King Vajiralongkorn was made the Crown Prince of Thailand, making him the official heir to the throne. His name translates to adorned with jewels or thunderbolts. He was a major playboy, even described by his mother, Queen Sirikit, in 1981 as being a bit of a Don Juan. He preferred to spend time with beautiful women instead of performing his princely duties. In 1977, he married his cousin, Princess Soamsawali. They had their first child in December of 1978, but then he ditched his blood-related wife and had 5 children with a young actress between 1979 and 1987. The list of scandals goes on, but King Vajiralongkorn's prowess was nothing compared to a much earlier ruler of Thailand. King Chulalongkorn was the fifth monarch of Siam, known simply as Rama V. He ruled from October 1868 to October of 1910, and during his reign, he married 4 of his half-sisters, along with others, and had a total of 77 children. While we don't know if any of them suffered specifically from inbreeding, historians believe there was a good chance, but the royal family would have kept that information quiet. Queen Laodice IV. Queen Laodice IV was a Greek priestess, princess, and eventual queen of the Seleucid Empire. She was appointed as the chief priestess in 193 BC by her father Antiochus III. Her parents were first cousins. Her paternal grandfather and maternal grandmother were brother and sister. Her brother Antiochus was named crown prince in 196 BC, destined to succeed their father. In the same year, Laodice IV married him. She then bore a daughter, and shortly after, in the same year, her brother husband died. Single again, she remarried her second eldest brother, Seleucus IV Philopator. Their father, Antiochus III, died, and Seleucus ruled as king in his place from 187 BC until 175 BC, when he passed away. The couple had 3 children while they were together, but after he died, she moved on to her youngest brother, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. She had 2 children with him. Basically, she went from the oldest brother down to the youngest, having children with all of them, so they were all related in many ways. Emperor Nero. Emperor Nero went down in history with a bad reputation. He was a deviant, violent man, and rumors go that he had a pretty disturbing relationship with his mother. To understand Nero's twisted mind, we have to go back to the year 65, when his wife Poppaea Sabina died. She supposedly passed away during childbirth, although it was rumored that Nero had kicked her to death on purpose. The next year, he married Statilia Messalina, and shortly after that, he married a man named Sporus, who supposedly looked a lot like his first wife that had died in childbirth. He had his newly married husband castrated and paraded him around in public dressed up like a woman. As evidence proves, Nero had a lot of different tastes and was a pretty colorful character. To make things even worse, he allegedly fell into a voracious romantic relationship with his mother. Some historians even believe Nero's insanity and broken moral compass was due to his own birth through inbreeding. When his father passed away when he was only 2 years old, he was adopted by Emperor Claudius when he and his mother Agrippina married. Claudius was Agrippina's paternal uncle, and it's believed that they were both products of an inbred bloodline going back generations. It could be that even though Nero wasn't physically affected, he suffered mentally as the byproduct of these family relationships. The Saudi issue. Saudi Arabia has a major problem with inbreeding, not just with royalty, but with ordinary people. Particularly in the South, the New York Times has reported that the rate of marriage among blood relatives ranges between 55 to 70%. That means that 7 out of 10 people could be married to someone in their own family. Take the recent case of a 17-year-old Saudi girl named Salah al-Hefthi, who was betrothed by her parents to her first cousin. The new couple had 2 healthy boys together, but the 3rd child was born with spinal muscular atrophy. This disease is almost exclusive to children born through incestuous unions or from a stagnant bloodline. This is such a big problem in Saudi Arabia that researcher Dr. Steven Schroeder called the country a living genetics laboratory. There is fear that the royal family might have a big problem, but are keeping it under wraps. The country is slowly coming to terms with the perils of inbreeding, but it is a cultural tradition that will most likely take many years to change. The incestuous Maya. Just like the Europeans, the Egyptians, and the rulers in the Middle East, the people of Mesoamerica also practiced incest, particularly Maya royalty. One of the best examples of this brings us to a place called Palenque, a jungle ruin in southern Mexico. While today very little remains of Palenque other than crumbling pyramids and mysterious underground tombs, it was once a major hub for astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. When Europe was floundering in the Dark Ages, the Maya were advancing by leaps and bounds. Ruling over the people of Palenque in the 7th century was King Pakal, aka Pakal the Great. He ruled from between 615 and 683 AD, a total of 68 years. That makes him the 6th longest verified ruling sovereign monarch in history, and it was over 1,300 years ago. When King Pakal's body was discovered in a sarcophagus deep in an amazing tomb in Palenque, it was a pretty major discovery. It was the Maya equivalent of discovering Tutankhamun in Egypt. His sarcophagus was elaborately carved. It weighed 22 tons, and his tomb was filled with precious artifacts. However, what we're here to talk about is his foot. King Pakal had a club foot, which experts believe was the result of generations and generations of incest. The Maya did this to protect their bloodline, just like everywhere else in the world, and it caused genetic problems. Even though King Pakal dominated the Mexican jungle for nearly 7 decades, he hobbled around with a club foot because his parents had almost certainly been close blood relatives. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time for more amazing history. Bye!